Hello, Bow20. Welcome to the Pathways of a Muscle Contraction. We are going to discuss how a muscle contracts, which you've already learned, but now where does the ATP come from? So today's learning intention is how do muscles use different pathways such as aerobic and anaerobic to get energy for muscle contractions and heat production. We are going to make sure that you can define the words aerobic and anaerobic, explain the role and use of ATP and whether or not oxygen is present, and explain the role of creatine phosphate in ATP production. I will link this wonderful video in that talks a little bit about what makes muscles grow, just some information and some interesting stuff that you can watch. This one is on what happens when you take steroids. Again, I will link this in as it is an interesting video about how muscles grow with steroid use, as well as some of the effects that happen when you take steroids. So where does muscles get their energy from? Well, we know it's ATP, and they need ATP to contract because once the myosin head has attached to the actin, we need to release it using ATP. So there's three ways that we can make ATP. One is through what's called the creatine phosphate breakdown. This is a buildup of the creatine phosphate when the muscle is sitting at rest. So when you're not using your muscle, you build up this phosphate. It's actually the fastest way to make ATP, but it only lasts about 8 seconds before it's depleted. So it looks a little something like this. When making, I should actually go back here. So when making the creatine phosphate, we're stealing the phosphate from there and adding it to ATP. So that's why it's so quick, is we're just taking the phosphate, leaving over the creatine. Now, creatine is something you can drink in energy drinks or in a shake. The idea is by adding more creatine into your diet, you'll pull off more phosphates that will then go into the resting muscle, and then you can make more ATP quicker because you have more creatine phosphate. Whatever your body doesn't use, you can excrete creatine out through your urine. So then we have aerobic cellular respiration. This only occurs, as we know, when oxygen is present. It happens in the mitochondria, and it provides most of the muscle for ATP. You guys should be very familiar with aerobic cellular respiration at this point. Now, interesting enough, myoglobin, which we defined as being what holds the oxygen to the muscle, makes the oxygen available for the muscle all through the aerobic cellular respiration. Because as you remember, we need oxygen to bind at the very end process. Now, this is what makes it interesting, is that oxygen or that myoglobin binding to the oxygen makes the muscle a reddish color. When you create ATP, this also produces thermal energy when we see heat being released during the process. So again, just another quick little diagram. Last, we have anaerobic cellular respiration, and this is when no oxygen is present, and we will accumulate lactate that will fatigue our muscles and cause muscle cramps. So over time, muscle fatigueness will cause muscle cramps because of the lactic acid buildup. Now, the more the muscle is essentially worked, the more mitochondria that are present in the muscle, and this will decrease the need for fermentation. So if you have more mitochondria found in your muscles, you will actually not need to go through anaerobic cellular respiration as much. That's why people train their muscles and work out their muscles, because as you do small micro tears to your muscles, as they heal and they repair with more muscle, they build up more mitochondria. So this is just another quick diagram about how we produce lactate. So the process for a muscle contraction, in the first 8 seconds, we go through the creatine phosphate breakdown. Now, this is just a little flowchart that you can fill out as we go along. If your muscle needs to contract for longer than the 8 seconds, there's going to be a different avenue. But if your muscle's done contracting, then it just relaxes. If that muscle needs to continue contracting, we have to go through glycolysis because, as a reminder, glycolysis happens no matter what, aerobic or anaerobic. It's happening in the cytoplasm of the cell, and it is breaking down glucose. So once that process has occurred, if oxygen is present or not present will determine what happens next. So if oxygen is not present, if oxygen is present, I was reading this backwards, then we will have aerobic respiration. Again, in the mitochondria producing a lot of ATP. If oxygen is not present, we're going to go through anaerobic respiration, which again, not a lot of ATP, just 2. Now, when we're talking about this, we want to also talk about when a muscle contracts, how does it normally contract? So the top graph, which you're going to add into your notes, is what we would call a normal muscle contraction. It has what we call the latent period, which is essentially the time it takes between stimulations, the contraction period, which is when the muscle shortens, and then we have the relaxation period, which returns the muscle to its normal form. And that is what it would normally look like if you were just using your muscle every so often, contracting and relaxing. The bottom graph, on the other hand, though, shows what happens when you have a stimulus that continually occurs before the muscle can enter into the relaxation period. So if a muscle is given a series of rapid stimulus, it has to respond without fully relaxing. And it just eventually does what we call a summation. So it just keeps building on and building on and building on that response or that stimuli. Eventually, though, we have to reach a max contraction. We call that tetanus. Our muscle just can't handle it anymore. Okay. And then once tetanus is achieved, that's where we see those twitches. So when you just cause a fatigue to your muscle's going to fatigue eventually, but before it does that, it's probably going to go through some twitching, some like twitches. And eventually what ends up happening is you will no longer feel it a blend out, and then your muscle will be exhausted of energy that it has. In your notes, please make sure to draw both of those graphs. You do not need to write any of the information along the sides unless you would like to give yourself a little bit of a definition of the 3 latent periods, contraction, and relaxation. So again, I will post what I will stop and make sure that you guys know what time to watch for this video, because there's just a small part that kind of explains a muscle contraction graph a little bit better.